I believe every civilization also has an Achilles heel in the dominant political discourse, and is our kind of Achilles heel the Brahmanical caste system and the trying to tell ourselves that we are a non-violent civilization? That was my question, and linked to that is a slightly contradictory question with using your trying to understand your phrase when you said, fortunately Indian civilization was not dogged by the existence of Satan. So how do these two things
sort of... Yes, this sentence has often been quoted back to me. Let me start with the sentence first, because that's easier to explain. What I was really referring to in this passage is that the importance of Satan to Christianity is two things. One is that he tempts Eve, and you have the original sin, which in a sense gives you attitudes to gender and sexuality. And then, of course, Satan is the personification of evil. And when I said that in a sense, the absence of Satan is partly the sanity, what I was really referring to was that you didn't have then this Judeo-Christian obsession with gender and sex to that extent. Of course you had people, I mean, you know, the argument that the woman in ancient times was much venerated and respected, this is a complete exaggeration, because yes, some women were venerated and respected, as they are everywhere, but the majority were not. I mean, even the Rig Veda, for example, talks about women as chattel when it mentions the gift of 50 dasis and things like that. And in the Mahabharata, when Yudhishthira is describing his wealth, he talks about dasis and describes them as chattel. So we know that for large numbers of women, life was not really all that pleasant. But anyway, the point that I was really trying to make was that there wasn't this desire that grew up in Christian Europe to condemn anything that had to do with sexuality and gender. And that was the main thing. Evil, again, I think that the Indian tradition is very aware of evil and is always preaching against the pitfalls of evil. I mean, one has to only read the Bhagavad Gita to realize that. But it seems to be less of a demonic evil. Now, this may be just my version of interpreting the text, but I think it was somewhat less demonic than the way in which Satan is depicted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that was really the point that I was trying to make with that sentence. On the question of non-violence and tolerance and so on, I do believe that this was something that was required as part of the nationalist message, and therefore tended to be overemphasized in the nationalist ideology. If you take someone like Ashoka, for example, who is always quoted as the first person that talked about religious coexistence, when he says you must honor the other man's sect more than even you honor your own, because it is by this that you really pay your respect to the other person. That's fine. He says that again and again, and one assumes that whatever antagonisms there were at that time, he was referring to those and was suggesting that you persuade people to your point of view rather than clobbering them on the head and saying, you've got to agree with me. But when it comes to the Buddhist Sangha, he has edicts, or inscriptions rather, where he says very clearly, directed to the monasteries, where he says very clearly that dissident monks and nuns are to be dressed in white and are to be banished from the monastery. And when you put the two things together, you wonder, you know, where does the coexistence go? In the one case, it's very apparent. In the other case, it is something quite different. And in a sense, this again goes back to what I was saying earlier, that many of these notions and ideas really have to do with the politics and the sociology of what is going on at that time. You can't divorce them. You can't say that religion is something which is completely separate and has nothing to do with the reality of one's social life. It is very deeply linked, and so this is the reason why. But then, on the whole, I would say that if you look at Indian history, it probably doesn't have the kind of extreme notions of extreme articulation of violence that you get, for example, in the Inquisition. I mean, I'm very interested that it is in medieval Europe, at the time when violence and oppression is quite strong by the church, that you first get the mention of banning and burning books, which is what we are doing now. And so every time I hear someone talk about banning and pulping and burning books,
Like Dinanath Batra.
Like Dinanath Batra and others, Subramanian Swami has said the same thing, my mind goes back to medieval Europe, where this is what was the message that the church was giving. There were some books that were put on the index, which meant that they were banned. You couldn't read them. And there were other books that were burnt, and there were regular occasions when you had the burning of books. So in a funny kind of way, we have had, let's say, perhaps a relatively better tradition on this, which we're now going back on.
But the Brahmana, Shashamana and the mongoose and snake, how did that work out? They were parallel traditions?
They were parallel traditions. There were parallel traditions.
There was no violence?
There might have been. I mean, as I say, Kalhana does talk about violence. I don't know, there may be other references. We have tended generally to be so taken up with the theory that we were an entirely non-violent people that we have not paid much attention to the texts that might have been talking about violence. We still have to examine them and see what they say. But otherwise, no, I mean, they're parallel traditions. It's not that they don't abuse each other. I mean, the Vishnu Puran, for example, talks about people who wear the red robe. This is the Jains and the, well, not the Jains, the Buddhists more. And it talks about the others too, who remove all the hair from their body and so on, and says that they are deluders, refers to them as Mahamoha, the great deluders who are leading people astray. So there is an abuse that goes on. But whether this abuse took the form of physical violence every time, one doesn't know. There isn't a reference to that.
You know, one of the interesting things about the, like you said, early Indian period, we shouldn't be calling it the ancient Indian period, is that Aryabhatta, for instance, using the genius of his mathematical calculus almost a millennium years before Copernicus and Galileo spoke about, you know, how the earth going around the sun. But this is quite different from saying that the existence of Lord Ganesha means there was plastic surgery and, you know.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, how would you, I mean, explain, I mean, that we need to be certainly proud of certain path-breaking.
Look, the thing is that, you know, one is extremely proud of mathematics and astronomy and medicine in early times. But the pride is not that you just say, I'm very proud and stop. The pride is to understand why these things developed, evolved, emerged, and what people did with them. I mean, you take Aryabhatta. He comes up with this theory, which is based on very meticulous mathematical calculation and astronomical observations. There were no telescopes then, so they observed the planets with the naked eye and so on. There was a debate that went on. When he said this, there were other people like Brahmagupta who said, we don't agree. And there was a debate. And what interests me and interests many of us as historians is, how did this knowledge evolve from the earliest times onwards? Who enunciated these theories? What were these theories? What was the debate on the theories? And the other very fundamental question, Look, Aryabhatta does this. We're told that in the 15th century there were Kerala mathematicians who had discovered calculus. And I remember going to a seminar where there was a discussion on whether the Portuguese Jesuits were not tracking down this bit of knowledge and sending it back to Europe. And did calculus in Europe emerge as a result of this? Now, people at this conference, which was held in Kerala, thought there wasn't enough evidence to prove this. But what interested many of us was that in Europe, Copernicus and Galileo, when they come up with this theory, become forerunners to other advances in science, to which this theory was very important. Although Galileo had to recant because the Catholic Church objected to his saying that. Why didn't that happen in India? That's a very fundamental question, that you have this bit of knowledge and you have people debating it and discussing it. You have it even traveling to Baghdad, which was the big center in those days from the 7th century onwards. But it somehow doesn't go any further.
Why?
Well, this is something that scientists should answer.
Okay.
This is where I think that the history of science in India needs desperately to be written, and to be written correctly.